All right, welcome everyone. Here we are, Agilists on Agile, talking today about the things that we encounter during the week and how we can come together and explore some of that. Today we have Peter Borsella, we have David Witkin, and yours truly, Ernesto Custodio. One of the things that I normally come across as far as questions and how to treat some things that aren't quite outlined in the Scrum guide or in any other guide is, how do you deal with tasks when it comes to an Agile team or Scrum team? To task or not to task? That is the question. And we are getting Brian Levy coming in red hot as we introduce the topic. He must have heard us and wanted to join in on this conversation. Let's go around. I usually read from left to right. I've got Peter on the top left-hand corner. Peter, what's your recommendation when you're asked, hey, should we task these? Should we break these user stories? Let's call them user stories for purposes of our conversation, which are synonymous with product backlog item or sprint backlog items. Should we task these items as a team? What do you say to that?
So I have a pretty straight answer. Once we clear up what the definition, right, of the word task, right? So for our Jira users, we're not talking about what Jira calls a task, right? We're talking about you have a product backlog item, you have a user story, you're in sprint planning. What do you do with it? So first of all, I am a strong advocate for breaking those PBIs, those user stories, into small work items that we call tasks, less than a day in size. Strong advocate, certainly when I'm starting with a new team. If a team matures to a point where the tasking is just like some rote activity they go through and doesn't make a difference because they still successfully deliver most of the time, then maybe we can back away from tasking. But they have to show that they have that confidence to deliver before I would even consider, right, not tasking.
I love how you distinguish the fact that, hey, what we normally refer to as task in Scrum is a form of decomposition of the product backlog item. It's a generic term. If you're using Azure DevOps, that might be called something different. If you're using Jira, that might be called something different. For purposes of connecting the dots, for those that are friendly with the Jira language, this might be a subtask in the composition that Jira tends to use, right? Excellent. Dave, what's your take?
Yeah, I'll add on first and maybe give a little bit more definition, and hopefully everybody can hear me okay. We are Agile, if nothing else, power outage today. So I am at my Starbucks office rather than home. I agree a ton with Peter. I love using tasks as well. I'm going to give a couple other use cases though. And first, to me, anything smaller than a user story is a task. So if we're looking at our hierarchy, right, everybody has different hierarchies, but anything, if a story delivers some type of a user value, a task might be horizontal. It might be creating a database layer, creating an XML file, things that maybe don't by themselves create user value. So anything smaller than that to me is a task. So with that add-on definition, I'd say to add to what Peter said, the other great use case for tasks is in troubleshooting large stories or missing our commitments. So let's say we've got a Scrum team and they committed to getting done 20 points during this sprint and they miss and they only got 10 points done. Well, a lot of times teams have trouble exactly saying, well, where were the delays? Where were the handoffs? So for those of us who know a little bit about lean, one of the things that we do is dig in and say, okay, we can just generally talk to the story and talk through why we didn't get it done. Or tasks may even help us identify, well, we had 4 handoffs here. We had a handoff from this task to that task to that task, all different people. And every time we handed off, things sat for an extra 2 days, right? So that can help us get more into the details about why things took as long as they did and maybe why we didn't complete certain stories. So very much in agreement with Peter, and there's certainly other use cases for using them as well.
I love that. We've got Brian on from his car. Not sure. I hope you're not driving, Brian. You don't seem to be at the steering wheel. That's comforting. And if you've been able to keep up, Brian, we started a conversation around to task or not to task. That is the question of the day. What is your take on that?
I'm in complete agreement with everyone else. Except, of course, I always have a little twist, right? So the twist I like to specify is that I found that making sure you break things down into those smaller components of 1 to 2 days is a good thing. It allows you to see when there's obstacles that people don't actually disclose. Now, what I don't like at times with teams is that when I use that generic term of tasks, they sometimes think about activities that they need to do, and they don't come out with a measurable result of, I want something of value, but even if it's not something of value to the stakeholder, I at least want to be able to confirm it with my team. So I like to actually, I sometimes stay away from the word task as much, and I let people know that hey, I'm expecting some sort of output, maybe even breaking the user story down into a smaller user story, same size, but make sure that we have acceptance criteria so I actually know that we actually completed it, and that it is something, it's not an activity, it's something that is a deliverable that we can look at.
And I agree with that. If I can plus one that, I think we're all in alignment with the use of task being useful. I coach around tasking. I believe that teams that break user stories down into tasks have a better understanding of the work that's ahead and are more likely to complete the sprint successfully. The caveat, though, is that you can easily get caught in the leaves and not see the forest. And you can miss that sprint goal conversation while you're focused on delivering individual tasks. So coupling that with keeping the sprint goal in mind, making sure that we are all looking at whatever measure of visualization and tracking and conversation to understand that we are on our path to complete the sprint goal is a very important part. Sometimes I've seen teams simply miss the sprint goal because, well, I was focused on delivering the tasks and did not see this other thing.
Can I offer something that's kind of like the flip side of that? It might be surprising to some people to hear this, but I've seen teams not complete the story or the request because they forgot something. So you had this, I see this balance now, Ernesto, that you're talking about, right? Overtasking or overly focusing on the task could cause us to miss the bigger picture. And then a counter argument is, hey, if we don't task it out, is it possible we forget something and we think we completed, but we didn't? I've even seen a team take their definition of done and templatized it right into sprint planning. So in other words, when they come with the sprint planning, they have a line item for every item on the definition of done for every user story they're working on, and they just go through it and say, hey, do we have to do this? Do we have to do that? Yes or no? And it sounds so, I guess maybe procedural, but they view it more as so we don't forget.
Part of what we're talking about, who's read, or maybe some of our listeners, the Checklist Manifesto? Anyone? Yeah, so I got a thumbs up from Brian, at least. If you haven't, it's worth reading, but it's very much what Peter's talking about. And essentially, one of the things they did is, right, this can't apply for doctors and saving lives, right? Stupid little checklists, right? For getting software. It couldn't help there. Well, the book, I won't give you the whole thing, but it basically tells the story of how they saved 100,000 lives simply by forcing doctors, most of whom didn't want to do it, by the way, into using a little checklist, a surgical checklist, to make sure they didn't forget simple little things. And the interesting finding, and again, I won't give the whole thing away because I think the book is worth reading, but was that the doctors, something like 70% didn't want to use this checklist themselves. Other doctors need it. No, not me, right? I'm a better than average driver. But when they talked about if a doctor was going to perform surgery on you, would you want them to use the checklist? And it was like 98%. Yes, because it worked amazingly well. So I throw that into the same category Peter just talked about, and I think it's a great rationale for using it.
And you mentioned a key element there that I think sometimes is missed. The definition of done is a checklist. It's a list of items that we're going to go through in order to ensure that we're building quality as we're completing our items. So why not make use of that in our live artifacts that are relevant to that which we're building, right? Too often we see the definition of done being this static document that gets put in a shelf and collects dust. And then if you ask the team, say, do you know your definition of done? They go, well, I think I do. But what good is that if they're not putting it to work? This is a great way to putting that to work.
Why not? Why not use it? So where's my PMPs? Where's my PMPs on the call? Ernesto, you know, a checklist is a project management tool. You know that, right?
Yeah, how do we
Right,
reconcile
right.
that?
I don't know if you've seen that sometimes people don't want to do things like that because it's too closely related to, you know, what traditional project management asks us to abide by.
And talk about reconciling. Let's bring that a little closer. How do we treat sizing tasks? We have Scrum recommending, or the Scrum guide, one of the rules of the game is that we size the work, right? The user stories. When we're doing that, we typically use points to do so, relative estimation. Now, it doesn't tell us use this or use that. You could use beans for that matter, but using something relative to something that you're familiar with in order to know how big that might be. And we tend to use the point system because it has many benefits. But when we're doing tasks, we tend to do those in hours, usually 4 to 8 hour chunks in order to keep some kind of time horizon, because these things are small enough that we can somewhat predict how long they might take. What's our take on that? Now we're jumping to time estimating when we're at the task level, but when we were at the user story or product backlog item level, we were doing relative estimation. What's
So I'm going to give
what do we have to
my
say about that?
my unusual take on this whole thing. Is, you know, earlier I was saying that, hey, you know, make sure that you try to get your items to be like 1 or 2 days, but try to get them the same size when you actually break them out. And I'm okay, you know, I'm okay with the concept of calling them tasks. I'm okay if we actually just make our user stories break down into that level. And then again, it serves the same way that we talked about having the definition of done and delineating those things as like a checklist. I think the same thing applies to your acceptance criteria. The only difference is that your definition of done are checklist items that can apply to multiple stories. So I put those in, and then your acceptance criteria just applies to a particular story. I'm also a believer that when I want to know how things are going with the whole sprint and the sprint goal, then the items that are in your sprint backlog are just a checklist to know that you've accomplished all the things with your sprint goal. And I think the same thing applies from a product goal level. I think that the product backlog is a checklist of here are all the things you need to complete to reach the product goal. So I think that, you know, when you talk about reconciling, I think that the whole framework of Scrum is actually built from the perspective of, one, creating constant checklists, just decomposing them into smaller pieces. And I do that so that I can make sure that everything's taken care of from a planning perspective. But then two, I want to give people that rush. You know, when you check off something from your checklist, you feel so good about it, right? You know, it's a whole difference when I use an electronic tool versus when I have a physical token, maybe a Post-it note, and I finish an item and I can ball it up and throw it away or whatever, or move it over and actually get that rush of a dopamine hit from actually accomplishing something. And again, I think that the whole framework is built on this item, this whole thing about checklists to give you that dopamine rush so you feel good and you can keep sustaining it.
Thank you, Brian, for putting that fresh perspective as usual on the items. I
want more dopamine. I want more dopamine.
I love it. Is anyone going to take the bait on the hourly versus the points? And how do we reconcile that part?
I'll take a quick one. And that is that, you know, for me, keep it simple. we sometimes there's a whole no estimates movement for a good reason, right? Sometimes we're making it too complicated. So I love the rule of thumb I think Peter gave earlier, which is, look, I ask a developer, again, a doer, somebody on the team who's estimating, hey, is this a day or less? Right. And don't estimate it any, further than that. Maybe you could go, is it a half day or is it a day? Right. And just leave it very, very simple.
That's actually something that is reinforced by the Scrum guide, right? You're going to plan how you're going to deliver these items by decomposing them further into smaller items, right? Something that is a day or less. Dave, you said no estimate movement. What is that about? Can you introduce us to what that approach might look like in a real world scenario?
Sure, but and I'll tell you, I am not this is not an area I'm an expert in, but so maybe the other panelists know more about it than I do. There's a belief, there's an understanding for most of us coaches that we humans are bad estimators, right? So what we do to combat that typically is relative sizing, like Brian was talking about. Fantastic, it's better. But how much sizing do we really need to do? And so I'd say the no estimate movement says, look, we're going to be wrong. Let's focus on, and I think the name may be a little bit of a misnomer to me. You're still doing, to me, in the back of your mind, light estimating, right? But what they want you to do is just start thinking, look, if all my stories are roughly the same size, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, somewhere in that range, do I really need to spend a whole lot of cycles sitting with the team, thinking about, how big is this? Is it a 3 point, a 5 point, an 8 point? How much value is there? Now, I will say, I'll throw you the counter argument, which I think is pretty good, just for sake of discussion. Well, estimating is not just about size. Good estimating is about getting on the same page about what the story is, and sizing is almost an excuse to have those conversations. So I'll leave it there for the rest of the panelists.
I love how you put that, right? Sizing could almost be an excuse for us to have the conversation, the alignment, and the understanding about what we're going to work on, right? I like to say that we know that we're ready for developing this particular user story because we sized it. The fact that we took that leap of faith and we somewhat align in a level of confidence as to how big something is tells us that we understand it enough, right? So it's almost a check mark there.
Yeah, and I think Dave, brought something else to the discussion that I think strongly connects with how we view this. The idea that maybe we could get our user stories all to be roughly around the same size. Because if you could do that, that does create a much stronger enabler, right, to move into sprint planning with a higher degree of confidence about what might be possible at sprint. I found that challenging. I'm just curious what the rest of you have found, in trying to get stories about the same size.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time talking to Ryan Jeffries and Chick Hendrickson, who are arguably some of the creators of the whole points for user story points movement, and they've shifted and said, hey, a better way to do it, made things the same size. When I made things the same size, now everything is easier, because instead of actually trying to do all this complicated math and discussing things that actually don't lead to customer value, now I can just count things. And when I can just count the number of stories and do some quick calculations to figure out where we're at, well, now it's just simple algebra to actually do all my forecasting and to figure out anything I need to do to make adjustments for capacity. It's a simple count. And I think there's value in making sure that you spend less time on things like estimating that don't give customers value, and more time on delivery that actually does give the customers value.
I agree on all the accounts. And I would argue that what product owner wouldn't want all their user stories to be exactly the same size and aligned perfectly? That's nirvana, right? But the reality is that this is a very hard thing to do. So I see the no sizing or the no estimating as part of an evolution, of maturity, a let's try to get there by making all our user stories consistent in size, right? Today, I'm sure as coaches, I can speak for many of you, because I've worked with many of you, I know that it's a challenge just to get the product owners to decompose these user stories into something that can fit into a sprint, right? The usual answer that we get, well, that's not possible. We have to get the whole thing. And we spend cycle times and part of our coaching life, providing techniques, providing guidance on how product owners can do this in such a way that still provides value and makes these user stories or these product backlog items smaller, to try to get them to a stage where they're doing it, not only that they're making them smaller, but that they're making them consistent in size, is something that I think will take time for individuals to master. Right?
Yeah, I think that's the bottom line for me. If I could say one summary statement about everything we've talked about, it's I don't normally get that high performing mature team that's been around for so long that they don't have to task, or all of their user stories are about the same time, about the same size, excuse me. So I find myself going back to the basics, the foundational expectations, those practices that maybe a more mature team would look upon as immature. But a lot of teams I work with, they're not there yet, right? They're not at that level of capability.
Excellent. So I think we've, in summary, talked about the fact that size, that estimating is a healthy practice, but that we should keep an eye on the big picture, on the value. Brian mentioned the acceptance criteria, the idea that we want to not only task items, and that includes everything, as Dave mentioned, that might go into completing the work, but that we also want to always monitor the value that we're delivering through the sprint. We talked about the idea that we want to make sure that the decomposition of those items can be as consistent as possible, so that there's less effort in sizing or estimating them as we move toward a more evolved or more mature Agile team, so that some of that overhead can be lightened. Right? Did I miss anything in that summary? All right, excellent. Well, thank you, team. We are at the top of the half hour, so we will reconvene next week. We got lots of hot topics coming up that we'll talk about next. Brian, get to where you're going safe. Dave, I hope you get your power back soon. And Peter, maybe we'll get to catch up again. We did in the morning. Here we are in the afternoon. Maybe we'll have an evening catch up.
Good to see you all.
Thank you all. Have a great day.